Okay, let's have a look at the poem Hitcher. And as with the other poems, it's worth having the poem in front of you and a pencil in your hand and just be annotating the poem as you listen. So what's the poem about? Well, it's fairly simple really. It's about a man who's in a car and who picks up a hitcher and who kills the man with a crook lock and then pushes him out the car. That's essentially what the poem is about. And again, a bit like Gooseberry Season, it's rather an odd subject for a poem. We don't expect, as I've said before, kind of conventional poetry to deal with such issues. In many ways it makes Armitage's poetry quite accessible, but it also makes it quite challenging because we're not used to being confronted with something which is quite shocking. So let's look at the first couple of stanzas and think about the contrast that's set up between the two characters of the driver, the narrator, and the person that he picks up, the hitcher. So if we look at the first stanza, I'd been tired, under the weather, but the antiphone kept screaming, "One more sick note, mister, and you're finished, fired." I thumbed a lift to where the car was parked, a Vauxhall Astra, it was hired. So when we first read this stanza, again, like so many of Armitage's poems, we ask ourselves questions. And I've said before, with some of his poetry, it can be a little bit frustrating because it's quite hard to pin meaning down. So this man had been tired, he'd not been feeling very well, and his answer phone had kept screaming at him. Who is the answer phone? Which is the voice? Sounds like his boss, doesn't it? "One more sick note, mister, and you're finished, fired." So this man is under a lot of pressure. Pressure to deliver, pressure to perform. He's clearly struggling with the pressure that he's under in his life. And the voice that's coming at him, that keeps screaming, and it's important that it's kept, and it's important that he says screaming there. Armitage has chosen those words for a reason. The answer phone's screaming at him. You know, if he's going to be sick again, he's going to be fired. So we immediately are set up with someone who is clearly going to be feeling quite stressed, who's struggling in his life, and who has a great deal of anxiety in his life. But then we get this rather strange line, or two lines. I thumbed a lift to where the car was parked, a Vauxhall Astra, it was hired. And we ask ourselves, well, why? Why does he thumb a lift? Why does he hitch to where the car is parked? Which car? Is it his car? Is it a hire car? Or we learn in the last line after that, the fourth line, that it is hired. So why does he thumb a lift to a hire car? Why doesn't he just take a taxi or walk? It seems rather odd. And then we get the second stanza. I picked him up in Leeds. He was following the sun from west to east with just a toothbrush and the good earth for a bed. The truth, he said, was blowing in the wind or round the next bend. It sets up an immediate contrast between the two men. The first man, the narrator, stressed, tired, unwell, a lot of pressure from work. The second man, a bit of a hippie, blows with the wind, full of cliches, and a bit of a drifter. So we have two men in a car, in a hire car, and these two men are clearly very, very different from one another. But we ask ourselves, why does the man do what he does next? I let him have it on the top road out of Harrogate, once with the head, then 6 times with the crook lock in the face, and didn't even swerve. I let him have it on the top road once with the head, so he headbutts him, and then smacks him 6 times with a crook lock and doesn't swerve. Now I think that tells us a lot about this man, and I think this is where he's quite similar in many ways to the man in Gooseberry Season, because he's able to do something in quite a cold-blooded way, and this seems to contrast with the anxiety that he seems to be feeling at the beginning of the poem. But then we look back at the beginning of the poem, we say, well, he doesn't seem anxious, he doesn't seem stressed. He says he's tired and under the weather. And even though the answer phone's screaming at him, we don't really know whether it's stressing him out. In the next podcast, I'll carry on with the second half of the poem.